Well, thank you again for doing this today. Tell me how you started writing novels.
I've been writing since I was a little girl. I remember when on a family vacation driving across the country and getting a journal, and I remember writing chapters. I feel like at that point it was really American Girl fan fiction. I have always been fascinated by the idea of being able to construct a story. I've always been telling stories in my head. I feel like all writers have the thing where we interact with fictional, hallucinational characters in our brain a lot. I wrote a middle grade novel early in my 20s, and that didn't really go anywhere, but then I started writing adult fiction more as I got into my 30s. And there's something absolutely magical that happens when you're creating a book, and there's just like nothing like that rush of seeing a plot come together and getting able to construct these characters and getting able to see who they are. There's a magic to it, and I can't get enough. It's an addiction. And I think Fly With Me was my 5th full-length adult novel, and that I had written that was a standalone that I queried, and it was the one that got me the agent. So that's kind of how I got into it. It's a lot of trial and error, a lot of being just delusional enough that you feel like maybe you can do this for real. So
I like that, yeah. I think I've heard that from a lot of writers too, that there's a little bit of delusion involved, and that's kind of what makes it magical.
yes.
And now, speaking of Fly With Me specifically, your author's note at the beginning mentions that you worked as a nurse. How does that figure into your writing?
Yeah, so I was an English literature major, and then I went to school for education, but then I found the idea of standing in front of a group of children terrifying. Because I really liked my special education class. I liked the clinical component of it. So then I pivoted into nursing. I've been a nurse over a decade now. I'm very inspired by the type of people who go into nursing and what it requires to be in that kind of high stress environment day in, day out. I started in pediatric transplant, and then I've worked in the neonatal intensive care unit. I've worked in general pediatrics. And then during the pandemic, I was working in the pediatric emergency room, which was a very interesting experience. I loved it a lot, and I loved the people that I worked with. And I found that environment, we laughed. We laughed so much because you sometimes just have to laugh. It's kind of heavy what we're dealing with, and there's laughter involved and some whistling in the dark that you have to do to kind of get through. And I find the idea of comedy and tragedy going very much hand in hand intriguing. And so when I wrote Fly With Me, I was very much inspired by kind of the fear that we were all encountering through the pandemic, and wanted to write a story that was going to make me laugh, but also have that like deep heaviness of heart in areas that wouldn't gloss over kind of what it means to be a nurse in the whole totality of your humanness. Because being a nurse and seeing those things at work, you don't leave it at work. It impacts the full extent of who you are as a person.
One of the things I really enjoyed about Fly With Me, and one of the things I wrote about, is that you sort of addressed both really happy things and like really sad as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't think anybody gets the privilege, well, maybe some people get the privilege of living life in a vacuum. So only one thing is happening at once. And even in my own life, I remember being like 38 weeks pregnant and helping with hospice for my grandmother. And you're seeing kind of like both situations, both sides of life. You're seeing death, you're seeing life, and it's all kind of wrapped around each other. There's a lot of comedy that happens with tragedy, weirdly enough, because sometimes you're just laughing because you're like, fuck else am I going to do? I think we don't get to just fall in love and let everything else in our life like be chill. I don't know about your life. My life doesn't always chill when I want it to chill. So sometimes I'm dealing with a lot of things all at once, and, falling in love is the same way. We're still human. It was just so important to me in that story is to see that just because other aspects of your life are falling apart doesn't mean you can't fall in love too.
And you've got another book coming out in September, right? That's part of the same universe. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, Fall for Him. So it is about Ollie's best friend Derek, because when I got the deal on Fly With Me, my editor at the time loved Derek so much and really wanted his story. The way I celebrated getting my book deal was basically to sit down and write Derek's story in like a month, and it made me so happy. And I love this story so much. In this story, I feel like the area that I explore a lot is my own neurodivergence and ADHD, and I was getting my diagnosis around this time. I think there was a lot of neurodivergent coded characters in my first book, but because I wasn't as aware of my own neurospiciness, as we'll say, I was more aware of it and fall for him.
It's sort of exciting how you sort of, get to build on the same universe. In your new book, will we see recurring characters like Olive and Stella reappear?
Yes, Olive and Stella they make appearances, and in the same way that I think queer people a lot of times end up with this found family, because with whatever is going on with our own family, we still need that connection and that unconditional love of the people in our life. And Olive and Derek are that to each other. And there's a character in this story that's probably one of my favorite characters I've ever written. So I'm so excited for people to meet her as well. Another bisexual.
You yourself identify as bi, correct?
I do. I tend to label myself as a whimsically socially awkward bisexual. So yeah.
I love that. How did you come to identify as bi?
I grew up very much steeped in evangelical purity culture. So like I was sort of very much out of touch with all of my impulses, desires, wants, etc. Because when you're raised in what's essentially a cult, you're kind of taught to assimilate in a way that is very damaging, and particularly damaging for kids, I think, who are neurodivergent and prone to black and white thinking. Because of that, it took a long time for me to understand. I was married to a man for a really long time, but I was still lucky enough to be reading and exploring my bisexuality through my writing. But I was very, very fortunate that I didn't just decide, oh, well, I'm married to a man right now, so I don't need to think about that. Like, that's not important. Because a lot of times when you say I'm bisexual, they're like, well, why does it matter? You're married, like, why does it matter? You're in a heterosexual relationship. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because relationships end, and I feel very, very fortunate every day that I did a lot of that reflecting during the time that I was still married, during the time all throughout that part of my adulthood, so that then, now that I'm in a different part of my life, that I've already understood who I am. It is important, I think, in every context that we reflect and understand who we are.
What has it been like for you to be out as a bi artist?
I think there's the artistic part of it, and luckily there's such a wonderful community of queer writers. I've been so lucky with the people that I've been around. But it is interesting when you get into a relationship with a woman and then people are like, oh, are you still bisexual? And you're like, yep, still am. So I do think that in a lot of other spheres I have that, but I've been very fortunate because the queer writing community has just been so wonderful and so welcoming to me. I know that there is a lot of biphobia out there, and you see how it plays out in certain types of media. I've had it happen with books where I get labeled as like a lesbian romance, and it's like hard because it's like, well, one of the characters is a lesbian. So like in that sense, there's lesbian. But when we get into categorizations like that, sometimes it makes me uncomfortable because I want to be like, well, no, it's a queer romance, it's a sapphic romance, but one of the characters is bisexual. And I do think sometimes I want to clarify that so that I don't get miscategorized, and so people don't just erase the whole other half of the relationship in my book.
Maybe one of my favorite scenes in Fly With Me is where that does sort of happen to Olive. We've all sort of been in that spot where somebody has compressed it either to a heterosexual relationship or to a lesbian relationship. And it's like, well, but what if it's more complicated?
Right. And we're still just as queer, no matter what relationship we're in. We're still just as bisexual, no matter what relationship we're in. If I'm saying this is how I identify, my relationship status should not impact whether you think I still identify that way. In so many aspects of how I grew up, I was asked to be smaller. And I think a lot of us are familiar with the concept of wanting to be everything that you are and having people be like, no, you have to fit right here in this little tiny box because that box is more comfortable for me. And I think being bisexual in a lot of other ways is like, no, I don't want to be in that box. I want to be attracted to people that are my gender and other genders, and I don't want to be in your little box. And that can sometimes make people more uncomfortable even than like if you just said, oh, I'm gay, or, I think it's interesting the way people react to the word bisexual too. I think there are also obviously a lot of bisexual stereotypes, and when you start to notice how some of those seep into your understanding of yourself, because you hear them over and over again. So it matters how we talk about being bisexual. It matters how we talk about anybody's sexuality.
At least for me, in my experience, that internalized biphobia for me was worse.
I think we are forced into this situation where we feel like we need to apologize for being ourselves. And I am sick of apologizing. I don't want to apologize for being the full width of whatever I am. I'm bisexual and I'm not sorry. Like, is it sometimes confusing? Yes, but I'm not sorry.
Do you have any advice that you wish you could have given your younger self?
Don't be afraid of taking risks and making mistakes and not fully understanding what you are at first. My instincts, though, were spot on in terms of who I thought I was, not being afraid to just say the thing, which sometimes you can look back and think, well, am I queer enough? Am I bisexual enough? Am I whatever? And you're like, no, you just are. It's not about being enough of what some external force is saying. If this is who you are and you believe it, then you are that.
Do you have any advice for those newly identifying as bi or queer?
We can never forget that safety is such an issue for some people when they're deciding how to express their queerness. And so I would say you are, whatever you feel comfortable is enough of being queer, is enough of being bisexual, whatever you feel is the right thing for you to do right now. So my main advice is to find your people that you feel comfortable in and being your entire self. However you can find those people, because those are the people that are going to help you feel confident enough to make choices that will allow you to be your truest self. But never let anybody tell you that you're not being brave enough.
I always like to ask, as we're getting towards the end, is there anything you want to talk about or share that I haven't asked?
A question I've been asked recently at an event was like, what do you hope for the future of like queer books sort of in the future? And I think one of the main things I always think of is like less biphobia when we're talking about bisexual protagonists, less bi erasure, allowing people to express their bisexuality in a way that does not need apology. And I think I already said that a little bit, but I think that's the main thing that I hope for in the future, that when you're writing, that we stop forcing characters to be in a box.
I read a lot of romances, both for work and for fun. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me about Fly With Me was Olive is bisexual, but like it's not a huge part of the narrative. And it doesn't need to be a huge part of the narrative. Like I did a word, like a search using my Kindle before, and was like, I think the word bisexual comes up twice, I think. And I think that was something that's like a stylistic choice, I think, that's different than a lot of the other queer romances that I read. Do you have anything, anything to share about that? Like what made you make that decision?
Because I have read a lot of books where the source of angst in the narrative is related to the queerness. And that's not to minimize the importance of those stories. I think those stories are very, very important, need to be told. But I think for my books, I just didn't want the characters' queerness, whether Stella being lesbian or Olive being bisexual, I didn't want that to be the source of their angst. I loved the idea of these characters interacting in a world where that wasn't the thing that created the heaviness of the drama, that it was other things. And because of that, I didn't say the words over and over again, because I was like, oh, well, it's just a story about two women falling in love during kind of a tough time in both of their lives. Nothing is wrong with walking around every day and saying I'm bisexual, but that's not, I have so many other parts of who I am, and they are all important to the totality that I am. And I don't need to have every part of my story individually as an author be about that. That being said, I'm very proud of my bisexuality, and I think it's great. And we have the coolest flag. It was a stylistic decision. And so I love getting questions about that. Yeah, yes, exactly. That's like, I think it's important for people to see themselves in stories. Like we think about the Heartstopper graphic novels where there's like a lot of that coming out, that decision making story. And, those graphic novels are so special to me. I love what Alice Oseman shows us in those stories. But I don't think that all queer stories have to have that coming out narrative. Straight people don't need to come out. I think about all the other romance authors, and no one said like, hey, I'm straight, just so you know. Because of that, I'm like, I don't want to feel like I gotta come out all the time in my stories too. Like it comes up when it comes up, and it's relevant when it's relevant. It is relevant at sometimes, but it doesn't have to be the central part of getting to know somebody immediately.
How can we keep in touch with you?
On Instagram, I'm Andie Writes and Reads. It's a little bit of a chaotic. I talk about plants and a lot of other things, and thrifting, as well as my books. And I'm also on Twitter. Twitter is Andie Writes a lot, but Andie Writes and Reads on Instagram is the one that I'm most active on. andieburke.com. You can sign up for my newsletter. I just sent my first one after many years of putting that off and procrastinating. And that's the best way to stay up to date with things like giveaways and that kind of thing. So I'll be posting about them in the newsletter. Make sure you check out Fall for Him, which it is a forced proximity, enemies-ish to lovers rom-com. That is the follow-up to Fly With Me, which was a fake dating sapphic romance. And I'd love you to check out both. If you see them out in the wild, let me know. Be sure to tag me in any photos on Instagram. I love to see that. It never gets old. It's still magical. So I'd love to connect with everybody. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this.